There was a time when Wall Street believed it was watching the birth of a new empire. In January 2000, as cameras flashed and bankers squeezed into a Manhattan ballroom, AOL announced a $165 billion all-stock deal to acquire Time Warner. Not only was it the largest merger in history, it was hailed as the moment old media and new media finally fused into one unstoppable force. On one side stood AOL, the gatekeeper of the early internet, built on dial-up CDs jammed into every mailbox, chat rooms filled with strangers, and that iconic "You've Got Mail" ping echoing through suburban homes. On the other side stood Time Warner, owner of Hollywood backlots where Batman and Harry Potter came to life, CNN newsrooms humming around the clock, and HBO sound stages quietly minting the next cultural obsession. One company owned the digital doorway. The other owned the stories, the news, the shows, the music, the magazines waiting behind it. Together, they promised to own the future. This was sold as the master plan: control the pipes and the content flowing through them, bundle access and entertainment into one bill, and turn tens of millions of dial-up customers into a captive audience for everything Time Warner could produce. To analysts and executives drunk on late 90s optimism, it sounded less like a deal and more like destiny. Let me take you back to that mood. The NASDAQ was soaring, profits mattered less than page views, and anything with .com in its name could raise oceans of money overnight. AOL's stock price, pumped up by this euphoria, was worth more than Time Warner's vast physical empire of studios, cable systems, and magazines. Because of that inflated currency, a company built on busy signals and chat handles suddenly had the power to swallow a media dynasty that traced its life back to the age of radio. Executives stood on stage speaking the language of synergy and inevitability. They talked about cross-promotion, data, targeted ads, and a new kind of relationship with the audience. They painted a story at times inspiring and at times chilling, in which a single corporate family could follow you from your living room TV to your computer screen and into your wallet. Yet behind the speeches, everyone understood the quiet truth. This was only possible because Wall Street was willing to believe that dial-up subscribers justified a $165 billion price tag. It's an example of what happens when hype becomes a business model. Within a few years, the bubble burst, advertising evaporated, and the grand promise turned to smoke. AOL Time Warner would record a $99 billion write-down, one of the largest in corporate history, wiping out unimaginable wealth, shattering careers, and leaving two humbled giants picking through the wreckage of their own merger. How did so many rational adults walk, eyes open, into what is still remembered as the worst deal in corporate history? To answer that, the story has to start long before the cameras and the champagne. To answer that, the story has to treat this merger as more than a punchline. The $165 billion union of AOL and Time Warner is a compressed history of an entire era, a single deal that captures the dot-com bubble's manic optimism and old media's quiet terror of extinction. There was a time when owning cable networks, movie studios, and magazines felt unshakable. Then a dial-up portal covered in banner ads walked in and claimed the future. On one level, this was visionary ambition at full volume. AOL controlled the gateway to the internet for millions of homes, the chat rooms, email, and instant messages that defined late 90s online life. Time Warner commanded CNN, HBO, Warner Brothers, the kind of media empire that had shaped American culture for decades. Put them together, the sales pitch went. You would get the world's most powerful media internet hyperlink. Content plus distribution, brand plus bandwidth, money plus momentum. But look at the other side. and it's an example of what happens when greed, herd thinking, and fear override discipline. AOL's market value, built on dial-up subscriptions and advertising dreams, had floated so high that it could use its overvalued stock as currency to buy a company with real assets, real studios, real cables in the ground. Wall Street cheered, analysts repeated the same phrases, and almost no one paused to ask whether the numbers had detached from reality. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the deal shows how intelligent people can talk themselves into a fantasy when everyone around them is applauding. So here is the promise of this story. The video will trace both companies from their rise through the courtship and euphoric announcement into the slow-motion disintegration and final separation. Viewers will see the early dial-up days when a free trial CD could change a family's evening, the moment when an internet darling felt powerful enough to swallow a media aristocrat, and the years when those same executives watched their combined wealth evaporate. Let me take you back to the champagne toasts, then sit with the boardroom arguments, the culture clashes, the quiet resignations. Along the way, certain themes keep surfacing like warning buoys. The danger of using inflated stock as if it were hard cash. The blindness created by status and legacy, as Time Warner executives assumed their prestige would protect them from a partner they quietly looked down on. The cultural arrogance on both sides. Tech cowboys convinced the old guard didn't understand the future, and media veterans sure that dial-up kids would finally grow up and fall in line. Anchored in time, this arc runs from the late 1980s and early 1990s dial-up era through the January 2000 announcement at the very peak of the bubble to the 2009 spin-off that finally unwound the marriage. By following that full stretch, from noisy modems to the quiet filing of separation papers, the next chapters will show exactly where the first cracks appeared and why no one with real power chose to listen. So let me take you back to a moment when going online didn't mean tapping a glass screen. It meant waking the whole house. You'd click, "Connect." The speakers would hiss, then squeal, then scream. A harsh electronic shriek, a grinding handshake between your computer and some distant machine. For 30, 40, 60 seconds you waited, staring at a progress bar that moved like frozen molasses, feeling, strangely, that you were about to cross a border. There was a time when that sound was the doorway to another life. The regular world had parents, homework, bills, and quiet living rooms. The online world had glowing chat rooms, strange usernames, and the thrill of being somewhere else, while never leaving your chair. That psychological pull was enormous. The sense that behind this slow, noisy connection lay a secret digital frontier that only a few people knew how to reach. Into that frontier stepped a modest service with an almost childlike name, America Online. Not the biggest, not the first, not the most advanced, but it made one crucial choice. While competitors threw raw command lines and cryptic menus at users, AOL wrapped the early internet in something soft and friendly. A colorful home screen, easy icons, email that looked like mail, chat rooms that felt like neighborhoods, curated news and games inside a safe, walled garden where everyday families could wander without feeling lost. This wasn't an accident. AOL's leadership understood something simple and terrifyingly powerful. If you could be the first doorway to the internet for millions of people, you didn't just sell access. You owned their habits, their time, their friendships, their late-night arguments, their impulse purchases. And once you owned attention at that scale, the advertisers would come chasing, waving money, desperate to reach the crowd gathered inside your walls. So the company went on offense. It blanketed mailboxes with free trial CDs, not thousands, but millions. then tens of millions, until kitchen drawers across America became accidental AOL warehouses. It struck deals with PC manufacturers so that when a new computer flickered on for the first time, AOL was already there, waiting on the desktop. Every barrier to going online was attacked: confusing setup, scary pricing, fear of breaking something. Just pop in a disk, follow the friendly voice, and suddenly your quiet living room was wired into a buzzing empire. His story is one of slow dial tones turning into explosive growth, at times inspiring, and at times chilling in how quickly a niche service captured a generation's attention. Because it's an example of what happens when a company learns to weaponize convenience, nostalgia, and habit all at once. And soon, this business built on chat rooms, trial CDs, and that awful modem scream would sit across the table from a century-old media dynasty, confident enough to dictate terms. How did a digital toy box grow bold enough to challenge a titan that owned CNN, HBO, and Warner Brothers? That's where the imbalance truly begins. On one side of the table sat chat rooms and dial-up tones. On the other sat an empire of stories built over nearly a century, wrapped in marble, glass, and old money confidence. There was a time when Time Warner looked untouchable. Not only did it own Warner Brothers, one of Hollywood's great dream factories, it also controlled Time Inc.'s glossy magazines, CNN's 24-hour news machine, HBO's premium drama pipeline, and a vast cable network that pushed all of it straight into American living rooms. This was not a startup. This was the culmination of decades of mergers, boardroom deals, and careful accumulation of power. Let me take you back to that world for a moment. In suburban Virginia, AOL employees were crammed into low-rise office parks, trading instant messages and pizza slices under fluorescent lights. In New York, Time Warner executives rode private elevators up into skyscrapers that overlooked Central Park, walked past framed movie posters and Emmys, and disappeared into wood-paneled suites where thick carpets absorbed every footstep. One side wore polo shirts and sneakers. The other favored tailored suits and private screening rooms. Time Warner's life had been built on one core idea: control the pipe and control what flows through it. Movie theaters that booked Warner Brothers films, cable systems that carried CNN and HBO, newsstands stacked with Time, People, and Sports Illustrated. The company didn't just tell stories, it owned the channels, the schedules, and the billing relationships. Money moved through its systems every month, almost on autopilot, while audiences arranged their evenings around its programming grid. Because of that control, the company was used to dictating terms, setting prices, and deciding which creators would be seen and which would be forgotten. Its power came from scarcity: limited theater screens, limited cable slots, limited pages in a magazine. If a show landed on HBO, if a film opened under the Warner Brothers shield, it mattered. The gate was narrow, and Time Warner owned the gate. Then the 1990s internet arrived like a signal from another planet. Suddenly, anyone with a modem could bypass cable bundles, post articles without a printing press, or stream grainy video without asking a programmer for permission. What if audiences no longer waited for Thursday at 9 p.m.? What if classified ads drifted to online forums and banner ads, quietly draining the lifeblood of print? It's an example of what happens when a fortress built on scarcity sees abundance coming over the horizon. Inside Time Warner's executive floors, the mood shifted from triumph to unease. The empire was still wealthy, still dominant, but the old playbook felt less certain. Cling to the comfortable tower of channels and schedules, or gamble on a fast-moving outsider whose culture, language, and metrics they barely understood. That was the question hanging in the air as AOL's market value surged past theirs and the wood-paneled doors finally opened to a deal. There was a time when both sides thought the hard part was the negotiation. Sign the papers, ring the bell on Wall Street, and the empire would simply merge. But hidden under that $165 billion headline were two cultures running on different clocks, heading straight for each other. On one side was AOL, a company that still smelled like a startup, even as its valuation towered over blue-chip giants. The life there moved fast. Executives in their 30s walked the halls in jeans and sneakers, new millionaires on paper thanks to stock options that seemed to rise every week. Their religion was growth. Subscriber counts, ad deals, new product launches. Everything was measured, charted, and pushed. If a banner ad underperformed, it could be redesigned by Monday, relaunched by Wednesday, and judged by Friday. Time Warner lived in another universe. Suits, not hoodies. Assistants, not instant messages. Power flowed down a careful hierarchy that had been built over decades in Hollywood boardrooms and Manhattan offices. A movie wasn't a 2-week sprint. It was a multi-year bet tied to scripts, casting, production schedules, and global marketing windows. Cable channels ran on long-term carriage contracts and slow, tense negotiations with distributors. Magazines were planned with editorial calendars that stretched a year or more into the future. AOL moved on internet time. Every quarter was a verdict. Every investor call demanded a new curve, higher, steeper, more dramatic. Deals with advertisers could be invented over a weekend, bundled with homepage placement, chat rooms, and email blasts, then tweaked again when the numbers dipped. It was a life of dashboards, instant feedback, and a quiet, ruthless assumption. If something wasn't working, pivot fast and don't look back. Time Warner's clock was older, heavier, and shaped by reputation. HBO guarded its brand like a family heirloom. CNN worried about credibility, access, and the slow accumulation of trust. Editors at Time and People thought in issues, cover stories, and the rhythm of print deadlines. When a show failed, the post-mortem might take a season. When a brand was damaged, the repair plan could take years. It was cautious, deliberate, at times inspiring, and at times chilling in its resistance to sudden change. That gap wasn't just about tempo, it was psychological. AOL executives saw themselves as the future, rescuing a dinosaur that didn't yet understand the web. To them, this merger was a transfer of power from old money to new money, from analog to digital. Across the table, many Time Warner veterans saw something else. Overhyped kids surfing a speculative bubble, rich on paper, light on discipline, and one market crash away from poverty. Pattern interrupt. Imagine trying to run one company where a movie slate needs 5 years and a homepage promotion needs 5 hours. Now every decision would expose the fracture. Budget approvals, product launches, cross-promotion plans. One side demanded speed, the other demanded process. It's an example of what happens when two clocks are forced to tick in unison under one roof. The real battle of AOL Time Warner was about to begin, and it wouldn't start on a trading floor, but in the meeting rooms where those clocks collided. But to understand why anyone thought those clocks could ever sync, let me take you back to Wall Street in the late 1990s, when time itself felt broken. There was a time when profits, dividends, and cash flow actually mattered. Then the internet arrived, and suddenly the only numbers anyone cared about were eyeballs, page views, and unique visitors. Analysts went on television praising companies that lost money every quarter but added users every month. IPOs doubled or tripled on their first day just for having .com in the name, even if the business model was a mystery. A pet food website could be worth more than an airline. A banner ad impression could be treated like a guaranteed fortune. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling, because serious people with serious money convinced themselves this was the new normal. Inside that fever dream, AOL looked unstoppable. It mailed millions of trial CDs, signed up families at a frantic pace, and turned the screech of dial-up into the soundtrack of a new digital empire. Subscriber numbers soared into the tens of millions, advertising deals piled up, and every new partnership announcement sent the stock climbing again. The company's market value detached from traditional measures of wealth and drifted into the realm of belief. On paper, AOL was worth more than Time Warner, even though Time Warner owned CNN, HBO, Warner Bros., magazines, cable systems, and real physical networks in the ground. The comparison didn't scare investors, it thrilled them. If dial-up chat rooms and email access could outrank movie studios and cable channels, then the future had clearly picked a side. Underneath that excitement sat a simple, ruthless psychology. No one wanted to be the executive who missed the internet. Portfolio managers watched rivals load up on tech stocks and feared losing clients if they stayed cautious. Media CEOs saw tiny startups valued at more than their entire life's work and felt the ground move under their feet. It's an example of what happens when fear of missing out becomes a business strategy. AOL learned to weaponize that fear. Its stock, inflated by optimism and page view math, turned into a kind of corporate gold. Instead of paying cash, it could pay with shares, printing new paper to buy hard assets, cable systems, content libraries, sports rights, and finally, the crown jewel itself. The more Wall Street believed, the more currency AOL had to reshape reality. And that is the central irony. The very thing that made AOL look strong enough to swallow Time Warner, the bubble valuation, was a mirage. When the air came out of the market, that imagined wealth would evaporate first, leaving the combined company with the debts, the promises, and a balance sheet warped by vanished dreams. The clocks were still ticking, but now they were tied to a bomb. In the next phase of this story, that bomb finally goes off. That bomb was wired to a company that believed it owned the front door to the internet. Not just a website, not just a service, but the gateway through which millions of new users would take their first digital breath. There was a time when going online did not mean opening a browser. It meant hearing that shrieking dial-up tone, watching a blue AOL logo spin, and entering a sealed, branded world. Email, news, chat rooms, weather, stock quotes, even celebrity gossip. Everything sat inside AOL's walled garden. The company controlled the menus, the search results, the channels, and most importantly, which partners were allowed a seat at the table. Inside that garden, nothing was neutral. Placement on the AOL welcome screen could make or break a business. A portal link could flood a tiny website with traffic or bury it in obscurity. By deciding who appeared on page 1, who got a dedicated channel, who was tucked away 3 clicks deep, AOL turned interface design into raw power. It was curation, distribution, and censorship, all wrapped in one friendly interface. Because of this control, the money followed. Brands that wanted to reach those millions of first-time internet families, suburban parents, kids discovering chat, retirees checking email for the first time, had to go through AOL. Media companies paid for preferred placement. Retailers paid for storefronts. Advertisers paid for banner slots that, at the time, looked like golden tickets to the future. It's an example of what happens when owning the screen means owning the market. And the audience kept coming. Those ubiquitous AOL CDs, stuffed into magazines, mailed to homes, handed out in malls, were a distribution machine. For a few cents in plastic, AOL acquired a paying subscriber who might stay for years. Monthly fees rolled in from millions of dial-up accounts. On top of that came ad revenue, cross-promotion deals, and premium upsells, extra email addresses, parental controls, exclusive content. The empire was built on tiny charges multiplied by an entire country. Inside the executive suites, this didn't feel like a fragile subscription business. It felt like destiny. AOL's leadership saw themselves not as a utility, but as gatekeepers to the digital future, standing at the boundary between old analog life and new online wealth. They had the audience, the data, the billing relationships, the front-page real estate, television networks, newspapers, record labels. These were, in their eyes, legacy tenants waiting to be told the new rent. His story is one of belief turning into certainty, and certainty hardening into something more dangerous. If you own the front door to the internet, why not own the content behind it as well? And what happens when a company is so sure nothing can touch its power that it decides to swallow an old media giant whole? If AOL's leaders were high on their own inevitability, Time Warner's executives were staring at something more unsettling: quiet decay. There was a time when a glossy magazine cover could set the national agenda, when a 30-second TV spot during a hit show felt like printing money. Now, circulation charts in boardrooms sloped down, not off a cliff, but with that slow, nagging slide that says the foundations are moving. On the cable side, early cord cutters looked like cranks at first, a fringe willing to fight customer service for the privilege of fewer channels. But in the data, the pattern sharpened. Younger viewers spending late nights on primitive streaming sites, gamers tying up phone lines, college kids talking about Napster and broadband instead of Thursday night must-see TV. Advertisers, always quicker to chase attention than to honor tradition, began quietly testing banner campaigns and primitive pre-rolls online, bypassing the old gatekeepers that had defined Time Warner's empire. Inside the company, the debates turned fierce. One camp argued that Time Warner had the brands, the content, the money. It should build its own digital platforms, own the pipes, the apps, and the audience. Another camp looked at the clock. Building from scratch would take years. Partnering with a dominant internet player, someone already sitting on millions of users, felt faster, cheaper, safer. Why dig a new well when someone else already controlled the spring? The irony was that on paper, life still looked good. Time Warner's cable bundles threw off cash. HBO, CNN, Warner Brothers. These were not failing assets. They were profitable but vulnerable. Business models built on scarcity and bundling. Pay one price, get a stack of channels never watched. Buy the magazine. See the ads chosen by someone else. The internet promised the opposite: abundance and unbundling, infinite choice, on-demand everything, and audiences trained to expect the exact show, song, or article they wanted at the exact moment they wanted it. Wall Street noticed the tension and applied pressure with a smile. On earnings calls, analysts asked, very politely, about internet strategy. Rival media conglomerates flirted with their own tech alliances, joint ventures with portals, equity stakes in startups that looked ridiculous on day one and dangerous on day three. In that environment, doing nothing started to look more reckless than making a bet that felt, at times inspiring and at times chilling, in its scale. Let me take you back to the psychology in those rooms. If the walls of the old media fortress were going to fall, the emerging logic went, better to own the invading army than be overrun by it. AOL, with its dial-up gateways and roaring stock price, looked less like a website and more like a battering ram made of pure market confidence. It's an example of what happens when fear of slow decline meets the promise of instant relevance, and when very smart people finally convince themselves that the only safe move is the riskiest one on the board. So when the two armies finally met, it didn't happen on a trading floor or a soundstage. It happened in quiet conference rooms, behind thick glass, with coffee that went cold while men talked about forever. There was a time when Steve Case and Gerald Levin could still tell themselves this was cautious exploration, not destiny. That illusion did not last long. Let me take you back to those first serious meetings. On one side, Case, the soft-spoken architect of AOL's dial-up empire, armed with charts that looked like rockets. On the other, Levin, the seasoned Time Warner chief, carrying the weight of a media family tree that ran from Warner Brothers to HBO to CNN. Between them, a simple, intoxicating line. Together, they could define the digital future. Case's pitch was elegant and ruthless at the same time. AOL, he said, already owned the front door to the internet, tens of millions of subscribers, oceans of user data, a brand that lived on every You've Got Mail notification and every free trial CD jammed into a mailbox. Time Warner, by contrast, owned the stories. Batman, Harry Potter, HBO dramas, CNN's global news machine, audience plus content, data plus brands, growth plus prestige. Fuse them, and they wouldn't just compete, they would dominate everything. Because of AOL's soaring stock price and Time Warner's slower growth, the power dynamic in the room tilted toward the dial-up kid. That could have gone badly. Instead, the courtship began with flattery. Case praised Time Warner's storytelling legacy, the way its films and shows had shaped American life for decades. Levin, in turn, marveled at AOL's growth metrics, its market valuation, its ability to mint money from monthly fees while Wall Street cheered every quarter. It was at times inspiring and at times chilling. Inspiring because the vision was grand, a new media tech hybrid that could beam Time Warner's library into every home online. Chilling because beneath the compliments sat something sharper. Fear. Fear that if they didn't move, Microsoft would. Fear that Disney would find its own internet gatekeeper. Fear that another rising tech player would wake up one morning and announce a deal that made both of them look old. Here's the pattern interrupt. For a brief moment, some voices in those rooms did ask the uncomfortable questions. What if dial-up was already dying? What if the valuation driving this once-in-a-lifetime merger was a mirage built on bubble money? What if the empire they were building on paper could never exist in real life? But in rooms filled with ego, legacy, and stock charts pointing straight up, doubt loses every vote. When everyone around the table has spent a life being right, the sentence, "What if we're wrong?" starts to sound impolite, even dangerous. And that is how a conversation that began as cautious courtship edged, step by step, toward a wedding that no one wanted to imagine ending in disaster. That wedding was sealed with something even more intoxicating than champagne, a $165 billion illusion built almost entirely out of paper. There was a time when that number alone made executives feel untouchable, as if sheer scale could protect them from gravity. On the surface, the mechanics looked elegant. AOL wasn't wiring over mountains of cash. It was paying with its own shares, shares that Wall Street had crowned with a soaring valuation. In an all-stock deal, the buyer hands over pieces of its empire instead of money. When those pieces are priced like gold, the buyer can use them like a weapon. AOL's stock had been bid up by investors who believed dial-up subscriptions and banner ads were the gateway to infinite wealth. So every share it issued to Time Warner's shareholders carried an almost magical price tag. Here is how the magic trick worked. At the announcement in January 2000, AOL's market capitalization sat higher than Time Warner's, despite Time Warner owning CNN, HBO, and Warner Brothers. The two sides agreed on an exchange ratio. For each Time Warner share, holders would receive a fixed slice of AOL stock. Multiply that ratio by AOL's inflated share price and then by the number of Time Warner shares, and the headline number swelled to roughly $165 billion. No factories were built, no new movies filmed, no extra cable lines laid. A relabeling of ownership created one of the largest deals in history. Wall Street loved it. Analysts rolled out words like transformative, historic, the blueprint for the 21st century media company. Investment banks circled the deal like pilots around a bonfire, earning massive fees for advising, modeling, underwriting, and blessing the merger. Because of their enthusiasm, the story hardened. This was not just a transaction, it was destiny. And when destiny pays, no one complains about the invoice. Inside the combined balance sheet, the illusion took on a quieter, more technical name: goodwill. When a company pays more than the tangible value of another firm's assets, accountants record that excess as an intangible promise. Future synergies, cross-promotion, internet growth, the belief that 1 + 1 will equal 5 instead of 2. AOL Time Warner booked tens of billions in goodwill and other intangible assets, confident that the marriage of pipes, content, and dial-up portals would justify every dollar. But let me take you back to the cruel rule of markets. What markets give, they can also reprice overnight. When investors later questioned AOL's business model, its stock collapsed, and the careful math behind that $165 billion began to look at times inspiring and at times chilling. The goodwill did not shrink politely. It evaporated. Within a few years, the company would be forced to admit that those intangible dreams were worth far less than advertised, triggering one of the largest write-downs in corporate history. It's an example of what happens when power, ego, and rising charts persuade rational people to treat hope as an asset. And the real damage would not be measured in accounting entries, but in what happened next, when the cultures behind those numbers tried to live together under one fragile roof. And when hope is written into the balance sheet, there comes a day when it has to be performed on stage. Let me take you back to January 10th, 2000, New York. A hotel ballroom turned into a television set. On the riser, 2 rows of executives in dark suits, a wall of blue behind them. On one side, the lean, youthful face of Steve Case, the internet prince of AOL. On the other, the older patrician Gerald Levin of Time Warner, a man who had spent his life climbing through cable, film, and news to sit atop a media empire. Behind them, the logos told the story they wanted the world to believe. AOL's bright, digital triangle, Time Warner's sober wordmark, now frozen together on the same backdrop, like a wedding photo that hadn't yet lived through its first argument. In front of them, the room was packed. Journalists shoulder to shoulder, tripods jammed into every aisle, TV lights bleaching the color out of faces, camera shutters firing in bursts that sounded almost like applause. They did not talk about risk. They talked about destiny. Case promised the world's first fully integrated media and communications company, a place where dial-up connections would carry Hollywood movies, CNN headlines, and music into every living room on Earth. Levin spoke of rewriting the rules of the digital age, of combining the premier internet gateway with the finest collection of media brands ever assembled. The language was grand, almost imperial. His story is one of old-world prestige reaching for new world code, at times inspiring and at times chilling in its confidence. On the slides, the synergy story looked flawless. AOL would supercharge Time Warner's content online, blasting HBO shows, Warner Brothers films, and magazine archives through its chat rooms and homepages. Time Warner, in turn, would hand AOL unparalleled, exclusive access to its vast media library and cable pipes, turning dial-up subscribers into a captured audience for every channel the company owned. More eyeballs, more ads, more subscriptions, more money. Not only was this billed as the largest merger in history, it was framed as the blueprint for how all media would work. Wall Street loved it. In the hours after the announcement, trading screens lit up green. AOL's stock price climbed. Time Warner's followed. Analysts called it transformative, inevitable, the moment the internet finally conquered old media. There was a time when those rising charts were treated as proof that the future had already been decided, that dial-up tones and glossy magazines had fused into something unstoppable. Far from the stage, in offices and break rooms from Virginia to Manhattan, employees watched on televisions wheeled into conference rooms, on tiny CRTs balanced near vending machines. Some cheered, imagining stock options, promotions, the thrill of joining the winning side of history. Others stayed quiet, wondering what this really meant for their jobs, their routines, their culture. Would the internet kids run the show now? Would the old media family be pushed aside? It's an example of what happens when power, ego, and perfect lighting make a deal feel irreversible the moment the hands touch on camera. Because once the applause faded and the logos came down, those same employees were about to discover what this marriage looked like behind closed doors, and who, in the end, would be allowed to stay. Behind those closed doors, not everyone was clapping. There was a time when questioning this merger felt almost impolite, like interrupting a wedding to ask if anyone had checked the bank accounts. Yet in the background, a small group of analysts, journalists, and even a few Time Warner executives kept asking the same rude question. How long could a dial-up empire really justify a $165 billion price tag? They looked at AOL's life in numbers. Tens of millions of subscribers. Yes, but all funneled through that screeching modem sound. A business built on per-minute charges, trial CDs, and people who hadn't yet figured out how to leave. Broadband was coming. Cable and DSL were spreading through the same suburbs that AOL had conquered. To the skeptics, this wasn't the future of the internet. It was a rental car being priced like a private jet. Inside Time Warner, some old guard executives quietly wondered why the company that owned CNN, HBO, and Warner Brothers was being treated like the junior partner. Their story was one of film reels, cable rights, and decades of hard assets. AOL's story was chat rooms and banner ads. The math felt upside down. But when your stock is rising and Wall Street calls you visionary, it becomes very hard to be the one who says the word bubble. Then came the culture warnings. Let me take you back to those early integration meetings. On one side, AOL's young executives in casual clothes, moving fast, boasting about eyeballs and synergies, talking as if money would always be cheap and growth would always be double-digit. On the other, Time Warner's media aristocracy, used to long lunches, careful negotiations, and a world where brands were nurtured, not blitz-scaled. Slide decks promised harmony. Quiet voices predicted war. Because of this looming clash, some advisors cautioned that merging a fast-moving tech firm with a sprawling media conglomerate would be far harder than the press releases suggested. They pointed to different incentives, different pay structures, different definitions of power. AOL people wanted speed and stock options. Time Warner people wanted control, process, and protection for their creative family. It was, at times, inspiring and at times chilling to watch both sides pretend those differences could be smoothed out by a few offsites and a new logo. Regulators also circled. Antitrust lawyers asked what it meant when the biggest internet gateway swallowed one of the largest content libraries on Earth. Would AOL favor its own channels? Could competitors get fair access? There were hearings, conditions, and solemn assurances that everything would remain open. Yet behind the scenes, many feared that combining distribution and content at this scale would always tempt someone to tilt the playing field. Here's the pattern interrupt. None of that stopped the deal. Once the merger was framed as the future of media, opposing it felt like betting against the internet itself. Bankers earned fees if it closed, not if it paused. Executives earned prestige if it launched, not if it shrank. Politicians wanted to stand next to history, not to be remembered as the ones who pulled the plug. When a story gets this big, when careers and reputations and unimaginable wealth hang on a single narrative, who is actually incentivized to reach for the emergency brake? The answer to that question would arrive soon enough, not in a memo or a meeting, but in the brutal language of the market. The market answered with a thud. On January 10, 2000, as the dot-com bull still charged and everyone pretended not to see the cliff ahead, AOL and Time Warner stood on stage and promised to build the future. A $165 billion all-stock merger, the largest in history, not only fused the world's biggest internet gateway with a legendary media empire, it signaled that the old world had surrendered to the new. There was a time when that announcement looked like the coronation of a permanent digital monarchy. Then, the ground under that throne started to move. Through the spring of 2000, the ink on the press releases was barely dry when tech stocks began their steep decline. The Nasdaq peaked in March and then started to peel away, day after day, wiping out paper wealth faster than it had been created. High-flying dot-coms that had bought Super Bowl ads with no profits and no plan began to vanish. Pets.com, Boodao.com, Webvan. Names that had been spoken with reverence a few months earlier became punchlines. Online ad budgets were slashed. Suddenly, the idea that the internet would effortlessly mint money for anyone with a URL did not feel guaranteed. Yet inside the merger machine, the process rolled on. Regulators at the FTC and FCC pored over filings. Hearings were held. Conditions negotiated. Lawyers drafted thousands of pages. Bankers calculated fees. Integration teams mapped how dial-up subscribers and cable lines and movie studios and newsrooms might be welded into one seamless empire. Every week that passed added more sunk costs, more careers tied to the outcome, more public statements that could not easily be walked back. Because of that momentum, backing out was dangerous. It would have meant admitting, on the record, that the valuations underpinning the deal were inflated, that the story everyone had sold about synergy and inevitable online wealth might have been a mirage. Executives who had staked their life's work and their legacy on this union faced reputational damage, shareholder fury, and a minefield of legal claims if they pulled the plug. Contracts, breakup fees, and the sheer complexity of unwinding a $165 billion promise made retreat look more terrifying than advance. So they rationalized. Let me take you back to those conference rooms in mid-2000 as the Nasdaq bled and CNBC anchors tried to smile through gritted teeth. Publicly and privately, leaders insisted this merger was different. AOL had tens of millions of paying subscribers. Time Warner had CNN, HBO, Warner Bros., cable systems, magazines, a whole family of cash flow machines. Together, they argued, this was not some fragile .com. It was a fortress. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the faith in scale, in content libraries, in eyeballs plus bandwidth equals money, drowned out the alarms. It's an example of what happens when a narrative becomes more powerful than the numbers. By the time regulators finally approved the deal and AOL Time Warner officially closed in January 2001, the bubble that had made it possible was already collapsing. The combined stock would never again touch the heights baked into that $165 billion price. On paper, the empire was larger than ever. Underneath, the market that had justified its creation was disappearing beneath their feet, leaving both giants locked together, staring down into the same widening hole. And the fall had only just begun. On paper, the merger was done. In real life, it was just beginning to come apart. There was a time when the new AOL Time Warner headquarters in New York was supposed to feel like the capital of a digital empire. Fresh logos on the lobby walls, glossy banners about convergence, executives telling the press this was the future of media and the internet fused together. Inside, it looked impressive. New badges, new branding, new slogans. Underneath, no one agreed on what any of it actually meant. Let me take you back to those first weeks after the deal closed. Employees walked the same hallways, wearing nearly identical ID cards that told completely different stories. Some still said Time Warner in old serif fonts. Others now flashed the AOL triangle next to CNN, HBO, or Warner Brothers email signatures became a quiet battlefield. IAOL.com, addresses bragging about online reach, legacy iTimeWarner.com lines listing cable systems and film divisions like battle honors. The town halls promised seamless integration. The applause was polite. The confusion was not. Day to day, the friction was immediate. AOL sales teams stormed into meetings with PowerPoints pushing aggressive online ad bundles, chat room sponsorships, splashy portal takeovers. They wanted money now, traffic now, deals now. Across the table, Time Warner magazine groups and cable networks stared back, thinking about what those same ads would do to their existing rate cards, their long-nurtured relationships, their carefully protected subscription revenue. To AOL, every eyeball was a data point to be monetized. To Time Warner, every subscriber was a delicate asset that might walk away. Because of that split, even the way decisions were made felt like two different centuries colliding. AOL teams were used to rapid experiments, shipping new features on Friday night and fixing them on Monday morning, watching click-through rates in real time, tweaking headlines, swapping banner placements, moving fast and apologizing later. Time Warner executives, raised in an era of quarterly budgets and decade-long cable contracts, preferred committees, memos, and long approval chains that wound through layers of vice presidents before anything changed on a screen. It's an example of what happens when one side treats the internet as a laboratory and the other treats it as a museum. Who owned the websites? Were CNN.com and Time.com independent news brands, or just channels inside AOL's portal? Who controlled online rights to HBO shows and Warner Brothers films? And who got credit for every dollar of digital revenue on internal scorecards that determined bonuses, titles, and ultimately, power? His story is one of boardroom dreams, but the lived reality was hallway turf wars. Meetings that were supposed to align strategy turned into quiet struggles over whose logo appeared first, whose team signed the contract, whose P&L booked the sale. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the empire that had promised to dominate the future spent its first months arguing over who owned which tiny corner of it. Before any external crisis could hit, AOL Time Warner was already fighting itself from within. And then, as those internal battles dragged on, a far more public disaster walked right through the front door. The public disaster had a friendly name. It was called Synergy. Not only was it supposed to justify a $165 billion price tag, it was sold as the invisible engine that would turn two aging giants into the central nervous system of the Internet age. On paper, it was flawless. Cross-promotion everywhere. AOL would shove Time Warner's magazines, movies, and channels in front of tens of millions of dial-up subscribers, while cable boxes and TV channels would quietly whisper, "Go online with AOL." Bundled subscriptions would lock families in. Pay one bill, get broadband, HBO, maybe even a glossy magazine or two. Shared data would be the gold mine, turning anonymous viewers into named profiles, letting advertisers follow a single household from TV screen to computer screen. There was a time when that sounded like unlimited money and almost effortless power. Then the paper met the people who actually ran the empire. Let me take you back to the cable divisions, the ones who controlled the physical pipe into America's living rooms. They were told to give AOL pride of place on broadband, to bundle it, promote it, treat it like royalty. Their answer was quiet, but ruthless. If AOL got special treatment, every other internet provider, every regional partner, every existing distribution deal would explode. Carriage agreements had been negotiated line by line over years. One sweetheart deal for the new corporate sibling could blow up hundreds of millions in guaranteed revenue. So the cable chiefs smiled in public, nodded on stage, and then buried AOL in the same crowded menu as everyone else. The content units reacted the same way, only with more prestige at stake. HBO had spent decades turning its name into a luxury brand. CNN lived on credibility. Warner Brothers guarded its films like a vault guard's wealth. The idea of dropping that premium material into AOL's cluttered, ad-heavy environment felt like pouring fine wine into a plastic cup. Executives asked a simple question. If viewers got HBO shows through AOL, who owned that relationship? Who owned that data? Who owned that future? Inside the company, those questions turned into accounting wars. Every digital initiative sparked a turf battle over whose P&L got the revenue, whose budget ate the costs, whose bonus pool would swell or shrink. Launch a new streaming experiment inside AOL, and Time Warner TV chiefs complained about cannibalized cable fees. Launch it inside a cable unit, and AOL leaders argued they were being cut out of the upside. Synergy required shared sacrifice. The spreadsheets rewarded solitary victory. His story is one of promises made at investor conferences and quietly vetoed in conference rooms. Synergy became a slogan, not a system, something repeated on earnings calls, but almost invisible in the products customers actually used. It's an example of what happens when a company talks like a unified empire, while every internal kingdom still collects its own taxes. And as the internal kingdom stalled, the outside world did something unforgivable. It kept moving. There was a time when the sound of the internet was a screeching modem, a progress bar, and a prayer. By the early 2000s, that sound was turning into something far more dangerous for AOL. Silence. No dial tone, no handshake, just an invisible connection that never turned off. Broadband arrived like a tide. Cable companies and phone carriers rolled out cable and DSL lines that stayed always on, delivering speeds that made downloading a song a matter of seconds instead of minutes. Let me take you back to those first cable modems in suburban living rooms. No more busy signals. No more waiting for mom to hang up the phone. Just a browser that opened and loaded page after page without flinching. dial-up didn't merely look slow, it looked ancient. That shift hit AOL right where its money lived. The company's empire had been built on metered access and monthly subscription fees, charging millions of families for the privilege of hearing that modem scream. You paid AOL to get online, you paid AOL to stay online, and once you were inside, you lived in its walled garden of chat rooms, news, and curated links. Because of that model, every extra minute a user spent connected meant more revenue, more engagement, more power. Broadband didn't care about minutes. It came with flat-rate, unlimited plans. You paid your cable company or phone company once a month and then stayed online all day if you wanted. No meter, no AOL middleman required. Technologically, it was liberating. Financially, it was brutal. The very thing that made broadband attractive to consumers destroyed the scarcity that AOL's pricing depended on. Competitors moved fast. Cable operators bundled high-speed internet with TV, turning the coaxial cable already drilled into the wall into a permanent on-ramp to the web. Independent ISPs offered faster service that dropped users straight onto the open internet, without AOL's branded welcome screen or curated channels. For a new generation, the browser homepage wasn't "You've got mail." It was whatever they wanted. Yet inside AOL, the response was hesitant, even timid. Dial-up was still throwing off enormous cash, still masking the decay underneath. Executives knew broadband would cannibalize that revenue, so they dragged their feet, tried to bolt AOL software onto other companies' high-speed lines, tried to keep the garden walls standing while the landscape outside turned into open prairie. It's an example of what happens when a business is too profitable to disrupt and too vulnerable not to. And this is where the merger turns from bold to tragic. AOL had sold Time Warner on its unmatched distribution, direct access to tens of millions of online households. But as broadband spread, that supposed advantage dissolved, month by month, connection by connection, until Time Warner found itself lashed to a gateway the world no longer needed. The market wasn't just revaluing a company, it was quietly erasing the logic of a $165 billion deal. There was a time when AOL Time Warner looked untouchable, a $300 billion colossus straddling old media and the new internet, crowned by headlines and cheered by Wall Street. Then the air started hissing out of the entire dot-com dream, and the market did something ruthless. It did the math. As the bubble burst in 2000 and 2001, investors fled anything with .com in the prospectus. High-flying tech names were no longer valued on imagination and projected eyeballs, but on earnings, cash flow, and boring reality. AOL Time Warner's combined value, once the proud symbol of a new digital empire, fell more than 80% from its peak. Hundreds of billions in paper wealth simply evaporated. The world's defining media company for the digital age was suddenly being priced like a mistake. Underneath that collapse was a quieter, more humiliating story. The numbers inside AOL were turning. Subscriber growth, which had once seemed unstoppable, began to slow as broadband cable and DSL lines spread through American homes. Fewer new customers were signing up for dial-up, more existing ones were leaving, and the famous "You've got mail" chime was becoming a relic of another life. Revenue that had been projected to curve endlessly upward started to flatten, then sag. Advertising made it worse. During the boom, companies had thrown money at online banners and portal placements, assuming the internet would alchemize attention into profit. After the crash, ad rates fell, campaigns were pulled, and suddenly those rich AOL ad deals that helped justify the merger looked fragile. The assumptions baked into the $165 billion price, relentless growth, premium ad pricing, infinite cross-promotion, were exposed as wishful thinking written into a term sheet. Inside the company, the mood flipped from triumph to triage. Cost-cutting measures rolled through the halls, travel budgets slashed, pet projects shelved, entire divisions told to do more with less. Hiring freezes spread across both the .com side and the old-line media units that had been promised endless digital upside. Executives who once talked about changing the world now spent their days in conference rooms hunting for real synergies, forced content bundles, awkward cross-promotions, desperate attempts to prove that putting Time Warner magazines on an AOL portal was more than a PowerPoint fantasy. And then came the psychological crash. The same deal-makers and visionaries who had been hailed as architects of the future were now accused of overreach, naivety, or worse. Analysts who once praised their courage now questioned their competence. It's an example of what happens when the market's love turns to contempt. The narrative doesn't just reverse, it punishes. His story is one of hero to fool in a single market cycle. So a deeper question began to haunt the boardrooms and earnings calls. Was this catastrophe simply bad timing? An unlucky merger sealed at the exact top of an insane bubble? Or had the entire business model been built on sand from the beginning? The answer would arrive with a number so large and a confession so public that even veterans of corporate life were stunned. That answer did not arrive in a memo or a leaked email. It arrived as a single, brutal number on an earnings release, nearly $99 billion. One quarter, one line item, and with it, the illusion of invincibility around this empire of cable channels, dial-up tones, and media power finally cracked in public. To understand why that number mattered, you have to understand what it was. In accounting, goodwill is the name given to dreams that have been turned into math. It's the premium a company pays above the value of tangible assets, above the buildings, the servers, the film libraries, and office chairs, because it expects future benefits from a merger. Synergies, cross-promotion, access to customers, the promise that 1 + 1 will somehow equal 3. On the balance sheet, all of that hope gets a dollar sign. There was a time when those hopes around AOL Time Warner were treated as almost scientific. Bankers ran discounted cash flow models, executives talked about monetizing eyeballs, and goodwill swelled into tens of billions of dollars. Not because someone had found hidden gold in the basement, but because the market believed this combination could dominate the future of online life and traditional media at once. Then came 2002. The dot-com bubble had burst, advertising money had evaporated, dial-up growth had stalled, and the stock price was in free fall. In the first quarter, the company announced a goodwill impairment of roughly $99 billion. One of the largest corporate losses ever reported. This wasn't cash leaving the bank. It was something stranger, and in some ways more damning. An admission that the value they once claimed to own had never really been there. On paper, nothing physical disappeared. CNN still broadcast, Warner Brothers still made movies, the mailboxes of America were still full of AOL CDs. But with a single stroke of the accountant's pen, almost $100 billion to serve value vanished. It was a confession that much of what had justified the $165 billion deal existed only inside bubble psychology and breathless PowerPoints. Shareholders were furious. Pension funds and small investors who had believed the story of a seamless digital media future watched their wealth disintegrate. Regulators, already wary after the Enron and WorldCom collapses, began looking harder at how executives used goodwill and merger hype to inflate balance sheets. The media, once happy to run glowing profiles, now labeled it one of the worst deals in history, a cautionary tale of money, ego, and overreach. And yet, the real damage was to credibility. Because when a company writes down $99 billion, it is not just correcting a spreadsheet error. It is standing on a public stage and admitting that the empire it promised to build. This fusion of old media gravitas and new media speed was, at its core, a mirage. The next question, for anyone still holding the stock, was ruthless and simple. If the dream was gone, what was actually left? If the write-down was a public confession, what happened next was the private reckoning. Not only had $99 billion in supposed wealth evaporated, the people who sold that dream to Wall Street now had to face each other in the same hallways, the same meeting rooms, the same elevators. And behind the polished logos, the empire began to eat itself. There was a time when the leadership chart at AOL Time Warner looked like a victory parade. Steve Case as visionary chairman, Gerald Levin as seasoned CEO, powerful division heads running CNN, HBO, Warner Bros., AOL. Then the numbers turned. The stock collapsed, and the same names became targets. Levin, once praised as the man who brought old media into the future, was pushed toward the exit. Case, the internet golden boy, saw his power shrink as directors quietly blamed the deal that had made him famous. One by one, high-profile executives walked away or were shown the door. Bob Pittman, the energetic AOL president who had sold the dream of synergies and unstoppable growth, resigned under pressure after being accused of overhyping the online ad miracle. Traditional Time Warner leaders, who had never trusted AOL's valuation, used the chaos to reclaim territory, while AOL veterans complained that the people who ran cable channels and movie studios were strangling every digital initiative that threatened the old money. Inside the building, the blame game became a full-time job. Old media executives muttered that the whole disaster proved AOL had been a bubble, a fantasy built on dial-up and marketing rather than real power. AOL managers shot back that Time Warner had refused to bundle broadband with AOL service, refused to promote online subscriptions on cable bills, refused to let the internet side experiment with new forms of distribution. Each camp told a story where they were the adults in the room, and the other side had wrecked the family fortune. For middle managers, it was less philosophy and more daily whiplash. One quarter, the directive was to integrate everything: unified ad sales, cross-promotions, shared data. The next quarter, after another ugly earnings call, the message flipped to cost-cutting, independence, retreat. Org charts were redrawn so often that employees joked the real growth business was PowerPoint. Titles changed, reporting lines moved. Restructuring became a constant rumor, and people learned not to unpack their boxes too quickly. At the ground level, the human cost was quiet but brutal. The early days of AOL had been about building the future, staying late because it felt like life was changing. Now, the late nights were about defending budgets, rewriting forecasts, preparing for the next round of layoffs. Engineers who once bragged about changing media now quietly updated resumes. Producers at CNN and HBO watched stock options turn to dust and wondered how a merger that promised so much wealth had left them with less money, less security, and less faith. Cynicism spread faster than any new product. Meetings opened with jokes about synergy that landed a little too hard. Managers stopped talking about 5-year plans and started talking about survival. It's an example of what happens when a grand corporate vision collides with reality. Not only do the numbers fail, the cultures that were supposed to be united are poisoned. And as the empire turned inward, Another, more agile generation of internet companies was quietly moving on, ready to claim the future AOL Time Warner had promised, and then abandoned. As the empire stalled and turned on itself, the rest of the industry didn't just watch the fire, they quietly rewrote their blueprints. There was a time when every CEO on Wall Street wanted their own AOL Time Warner, their own all-in-one empire of pipes, portals, and prestige content. After the write-downs, the culture war, and the missing billions, that dream suddenly looked less like destiny and more like a career-ending hallucination. Behind closed doors, other media giants shelved their grand marriage proposals. Deals that had been pitched as transformative went silent. Boards that once drooled over cross-promotion charts now asked a colder question. If the company that owned CNN, HBO, Warner Bros., and the Internet's front door couldn't make synergy work, who exactly thought they could? Bankers kept bringing glossy decks. Executives kept nodding politely. Then they scaled back, carved up, or walked away. It was corporate romance, followed by a very sober morning. Meanwhile, a different breed of company was taking notes. Let me take you back to the early 2000s, when a small search engine called Google watched this chaos from the sidelines. Instead of racing to buy a Hollywood studio, Google built one thing first: a dominant platform. Search, then ads, then the infrastructure that printed money at scale. Only after that foundation was unshakable did they pick up content assets like YouTube, not as an identity crisis, but as an extension of a machine that already worked. Facebook followed the same script with a more ruthless social twist. First, build the network, lock in the audience, perfect the data and the ad engine. Then, and only then, start acquiring. Instagram, WhatsApp. Pieces that fit the existing life of the product instead of trying to bolt on an entirely different culture. Their story is one of learning from someone else's pain. Watching AOL Time Warner, they saw what happens when a company tries to invent a future by stapling two pasts together. Cable and telecom players learned a quieter but equally brutal lesson. Owning the pipe was powerful. Controlling the last mile into the family living room meant steady cash, leverage, and a defensive moat. But owning the pipe and then trying to swallow an entire media empire on top of it? That looked dangerous now. When Comcast went after NBC Universal, or when AT&T later chased Time Warner, the deals were pitched with more caution, more focus, more legal fine print about governance and integration. Everyone pretended this was brand new strategy. The ghost of AOL Time Warner hovered over every slide. Investors changed too. The word synergy had once added billions to a valuation. Now it triggered nervous laughter. Fund managers who had cheered the $165 billion merger began demanding something far less glamorous: clear, standalone business fundamentals. Could each unit make money on its own? Did the cultures actually match? Or was this just another PowerPoint fantasy stitched together with stock? The market had seen what hype could do to wealth, and it did not want a sequel. In trying to create an unbeatable empire, AOL Time Warner finally became something else. A cautionary tale that at times inspiring and at times chilling, shaped how the next generation of media tech power would be built. It's an example of what happens when ambition runs ahead of architecture, when money and power move faster than integration. And as the industry absorbed that lesson, a new question emerged, one that would define the next act of this story. What happens when the platforms that learned from this disaster become bigger than any old media giant ever was? The logic that once promised a seamless media tech empire now began to work in reverse. The same deal that was supposed to conquer the future had created something too clumsy to move. And Wall Street, which had cheered the marriage, now started quietly asking a brutal question. What can be sold off first? There was a time when AOL Time Warner sounded like destiny. Now it sounded like a garage sale. The company began peeling away pieces, selling off Time Warner Book Group, unloading Warner Music, spinning off cable systems, trimming regional magazines. Each move was framed as focus and discipline, but the pattern was clear. To save the core, they had to amputate the limbs, one asset at a time, turning a once expansive vision into a series of retreat lines. At the center of the problem sat the name that had once carried so much power: AOL. In the late 90s, it was the front door to the internet, the brand every family knew from those endless trial CDs. Now, broadband spread through America, dial-up withered, and every quarter the subscriber chart pointed one way: down. Because the merger had locked in a huge valuation for that shrinking business, its decline dragged on the entire company's wealth like an anchor chained to the hull. Executives tried to manage the embarrassment. They stopped leading with AOL in earnings calls, shifted the spotlight back to HBO, to Warner Bros., to CNN, to the content library that actually made money. Let me take you back to those presentations. Glossy slides about premium storytelling, iconic brands, global franchises, with the old dial-up giant pushed into smaller boxes, new logos, vague language about online services. The proud acquirer was now the awkward cousin at the family reunion, still invited, but carefully kept out of the photos. Inside the company, rebranding became a survival tactic. The AOL division experimented with portals, advertising networks, instant messaging, anything that might turn a fading access business into a digital media platform. Meanwhile, Time Warner's side leaned into what it knew: films, cable channels, subscription TV. His story is one of integration promised and then quietly abandoned, as the empire retreated to the territories that still obeyed the old rules of audience, ratings, and box office. Outside, investors lost patience. Analysts began publishing breakup valuations, arguing that HBO alone, or the cable networks alone, might be worth more freed from AOL's shadow. They ran the numbers, stripped out the dial-up decay, and reached a ruthless conclusion: the parts were worth more than the struggling whole. It's an example of what happens when a grand narrative collides with quarterly reports. Poetry gives way to spreadsheets. Finally, the logic became undeniable. The forces that once pushed these companies together now pulled them apart. The premium content wanted one future, the dying access business demanded another, and the market refused to subsidize the marriage any longer. The only real question left was not whether AOL and Time Warner would separate, but how messy the unwinding would be, and who would be left holding the bill when the most expensive love story in corporate history officially fell out of love. By 2009, that most expensive love story in corporate history finally got its quiet divorce papers. No stadium announcement, no Super Bowl ads, no CEOs promising a new digital empire. Just a carefully worded filing and a press release explaining that Time Warner would separate AOL into an independent, publicly traded company to unlock shareholder value and enhance strategic focus. In other words, this marriage was over. Let me take you back to how that actually worked. On paper, the spin-off was simple. Time Warner carved AOL out of its balance sheet, distributed AOL shares to existing Time Warner investors, and sent the former crown jewel back into the world as a standalone listed company again. No cash windfall, no dramatic bidding war, just a legal and financial untangling of what had once been sold as the future of media, money, and power under one roof. There was a time when that roof was supposed to be invincible. The whole premise of the 2000 deal was that owning both distribution and content would create unstoppable wealth. AOL's dial-up audience funneled into Time Warner's movies, magazines, and cable networks, all monetized with targeted ads and bundled subscriptions. The spin-off announcement, with its muted language and almost apologetic tone, quietly admitted that this dream had failed. The synergies that were meant to justify a $165 billion price tag never really appeared. What did appear were write-downs, culture wars, and a decade of lost opportunity. Because of that failure, both sides walked into 2009 diminished. AOL, once the gateway to the internet, now limped along with shrinking dial-up revenue and a patchwork of ad tech and content bets that hadn't replaced the old subscription cash. Its brand, which had once stood for the future, now evoked the screech of a modem and a slower, more naive era of online life. Time Warner, still powerful, still owning CNN, HBO, and Warner Bros., looked more like a battered veteran than a visionary pioneer, scarred by the merger and far more cautious about chasing the next big thing. Here's the pattern interrupt. On the day of the spin-off, there was no grand villain, no spectacular collapse, no dramatic courtroom showdown. Just a shrug. Markets barely flinched. Commentators treated the news less like a revolution and more like the final page of a long, predictable story. It's an example of what happens when a deal dies not with an explosion, but with a slow leak. The spin-off was the last act in a long unwinding. The goodwill write-downs, the executive exits, the cultural battles, all of it had been leading here. His story is one of euphoria turning into embarrassment, of corporate pride meeting technological reality. By sending AOL back into the market alone, Time Warner closed the loop on a decade-long experiment that had promised to redefine media and instead became, at times inspiring and at times chilling, a warning. The separation was quiet, but the lesson would echo into the next wave of tech media dreams. The separation was quiet, but the bill for the dream was anything but. On paper, this empire of dial-up and movies had once been worth hundreds of billions. Then, almost overnight in market time, that wealth didn't move, didn't transfer, didn't even really change hands. It just vanished. There was a time when AOL Time Warner's combined market cap, inflated by bubble euphoria, made it one of the most valuable companies on Earth. At the peak, investors were paying for a story that every screen, every song, every film would flow through one corporate gateway. When the bubble burst and the merger's illusions were exposed, the value of that dream collapsed by more than 80%, turning a $165 billion promise into a write-down of roughly $99 billion and a crater of lost shareholder money stretching into the hundreds of billions. Behind those numbers were real lives. Pension funds that had dutifully bought blue-chip Time Warner shares for decades suddenly found that their safe anchor had been lashed to a sinking ship. Teachers' retirements, city workers' pensions, union funds that had trusted old media stability were now tied to a dial-up fantasy. Individual investors who had believed the hype watched their brokerage statements shrink month after month, while employees who had been paid in stock and options learned the cruel lesson that paper wealth can evaporate faster than any paycheck. Because so many insiders were compensated in equity, the people building the empire were hit twice. They lost jobs in restructuring waves and watched the value of their options disintegrate. Some had planned college for their children or early retirement for aging parents around those shares. Instead, they were left explaining to family why the once invincible brand on their business card no longer guaranteed security or even relevance. And then there was trust. The merger had been sold by top executives, blessed by star Wall Street bankers, and cheered on by analysts who called it inevitable. When the numbers turned, that chorus went quiet. Because of this, confidence in corporate leadership took a direct hit. The same CEOs who had promised a frictionless digital future were now writing history's largest goodwill impairment. It's an example of what happens when leaders start believing their own press releases more than their balance sheets. Regulators and prosecutors took notice. Investigations probed whether AOL had aggressively booked advertising deals, swapped revenue, and smoothed numbers to keep the growth story alive through the merger. The company faced accounting probes, shareholder lawsuits, and settlements over disclosure practices, adding legal costs and reputational scars to the financial wreckage. Even when fines were manageable, the headlines were not. Let me take you back to the mood of those early 2000s hearings and earnings calls. The same grand narratives that had sounded, at times inspiring and at times chilling, now rang hollow. If inevitable futures could end this badly, what else was negotiable? The losses from AOL Time Warner did more than crush a stock chart. They helped puncture faith in the very idea that a single, all-powerful platform could own the Internet's destiny. And yet, as the next wave of tech visionaries was already preparing its pitch, that lesson was about to be tested again. There was a time when every serious CEO in media and telecom woke up with the same quiet fear. What if the Internet left them behind? Not losing a little market share, but losing their life's work, their empire, their carefully built legacy to some 25-year-old in a hoodie and a rented office. Let me take you back to that late 1990s boardroom psychology. AOL's stock was soaring, dial-up subscribers were piling in, and analysts talked about eyeballs, with the confidence once reserved for cash flow. Because everyone else was paying insane multiples for anything with a .com, not paying those multiples yourself started to look reckless. Herd behavior took over. If one giant paid up for internet scale, the rest had to follow, or risk being labeled obsolete, timid, already halfway to poverty in Wall Street's eyes. Inside Time Warner, that fear had a very specific flavor. Cable bundles, magazines, movie studios, CNN, HBO. On paper, that was real wealth, real power. But the story being told on CNBC every night said something different. Distribution was dead. Portals were destiny. So when AOL came knocking, the deal didn't just look attractive, it looked like a lifeline. It's an example of what happens when leaders stop asking, "Is this price rational?" and start asking, "What will people say if we don't?" From there, confirmation bias did the rest. Bankers arrived with thick pitch books, colorful charts, and conservative projections that somehow all pointed in one direction: synergy. Cross-promotion between AOL chat rooms and Warner Brothers movies, instant streaming of Time Warner's library, targeted ads wrapped around CNN News, pages and pages of upside. The risks, the dial-up model, the fragile ad market, the culture clash were there, but tucked into appendices, spoken quickly, treated like formalities rather than flashing red lights. Because of status and legacy, those red lights were easy to ignore. No one at the top wanted to be remembered as the cautious caretaker who watched the internet revolution from the sidelines. They wanted to be the visionary who bet the company, rewrote the rules, finally fused old media and new into a single, unstoppable empire. The money was huge, but the statue in the lobby, the biography on the shelf, the whisper that he saw it before anyone else, mattered almost as much. Inside the boardroom, groupthink sealed the fate. A few directors questioned the price, wondered how long dial-up could last, asked what would happen if the bubble popped. But in the glow of unanimous seeming enthusiasm, external praise, and a stock market roaring approval, those doubts sounded small, almost impolite. No one wanted to be the lone voice against the largest, most transformative merger in history. Not only was dissent unwelcome, it was quietly framed as fear. His story is one of numbers, but this deal was driven by narrative. The AOL Time Warner merger wasn't just a financial miscalculation. It was a case study in how a thrilling story about the future can overpower the cold arithmetic of the present. And as the crash would soon reveal, those same executives were about to learn what happens when the narrative breaks and the numbers finally speak. The way they spoke and who paid the price would shock even Wall Street. There was a time when AOL's most valuable product wasn't dial-up access, chat rooms, or those shiny CDs flooding every mailbox in America. Its real product was the stock price. The ticker itself became the story, a public scoreboard of power, and the leadership learned to treat that rising number as both currency and proof that their empire could only grow. Because AOL's shares traded at dizzying multiples, they could use them like high-denomination money. Instead of paying cash, they paid with paper, issuing stock to buy companies, partnerships, and, eventually, Time Warner. Each deal said to Wall Street, "Look who's paying with inflated shares and still getting invited to the table." The more they acquired, the more it looked like domination. The more domination, the higher the stock climbed. That created a dangerous loop. A soaring stock price enabled bigger acquisitions, which generated headlines about inevitable digital conquest, which then pushed the stock even higher. Analysts pointed to the chart as evidence that the future belonged to AOL. Executives pointed to the analysts as evidence that the chart was right. It was an echo chamber with a market cap. Let me take you back to those late 1990s earnings calls. What mattered most were subscriber counts and ad deals. Millions of new dial-up users. Multi-year advertising partnerships booked up front. It looked like unstoppable growth. But behind the scenes, the company was still running on creaking dial-up infrastructure, while broadband was quietly spreading through cable lines and phone companies. The short-term numbers looked beautiful. The long-term foundations were fragile. Because the stock price had become the core asset, every quarter turned into a test of faith. Miss the narrative, and the market might punish the shares. So leadership managed to the story. Marketing deals were structured to maximize reported revenue. Promotions were pushed to inflate subscriber figures, even if those users churned out later. Engineering investments that would have prepared AOL for a broadband world were easier to delay than a press release about record growth. It's an example of what happens when executives start optimizing for headlines instead of resilience. The media loved the tale. A company born out of dial-up poverty now buying one of the richest media families on Earth. Commentators called it visionary. Inside the boardroom, that praise became another data point, another reason to keep feeding the narrative rather than questioning it. Then comes the pattern interrupt that every hype-driven empire eventually meets. Sentiment shifts. The dot-com bubble starts to wobble. Suddenly, the same metrics that once inspired awe now invite scrutiny. How durable are those ad contracts? How loyal are those subscribers? How valuable is an acquisition made with overvalued shares when the market decides the story is over? His story is one of numbers finally catching up with narrative. When hype is treated as an asset, any change in belief doesn't just dent egos, it erases wealth, careers, and entire corporate identities almost overnight. The AOL Time Warner merger would soon show just how brutal that erasure could be. There was a time when executives thought culture was just wallpaper, something you hang behind a $165 billion announcement and forget about. The AOL Time Warner merger would prove that culture is not wallpaper, it's wiring. And when you splice the wrong wires together, the entire empire catches fire. Let me take you back to the mindset inside AOL at the peak of its power. This was a company that grew by sending millions of CDs into American homes, turning dial-up noise into money, power, and market share. The culture was pure cowboy, aggressive, informal, and relentlessly forward. Sales teams closed deals in days, not months. Rules were suggestions. If a promise helped hit the quarter's growth target, someone would make it and figure out the details later. It was a life lived on fast forward, where yesterday's success already felt like poverty compared to tomorrow's projections. Time Warner lived on a different planet. Its world was old New York media, where the hallways were lined with Oscars, Emmys, and people who had each spent decades protecting a brand. Think courtiers in a royal court, status-conscious, protocol-driven, always aware of which division outranked which. Meetings had agendas, pre-meetings, and follow-up memos. Relationships with cable providers, advertisers, and Hollywood talent were treated like a delicate family inheritance, not a chip to be pushed all in on the latest internet craze. When those two worlds collided, the clash was immediate, and at times inspiring, and at times chilling, to watch. AOL salespeople would walk into a room, wave the AOL logo like a royal seal, and promise that Time Warner magazines would feature exclusive content, that Warner Brothers films would get special online premieres, that CNN would integrate chat rooms and interactive features on a tight deadline. Then those promises would land on the desks of Time Warner division heads who had never been asked, never agreed, and had no intention of letting an internet upstart dictate their release schedules. The reverse happened too. Time Warner executives would announce carefully curated cross-promotions, assuming AOL would politely slot them into prime homepage real estate. The cowboys looked at the traffic numbers, saw better short-term ad money elsewhere, and quietly buried the strategic content. Each side felt betrayed. Each side was sure the other just didn't get it. Underneath the rhetoric about one company, the money told a different story. AOL people were paid like growth hackers. Stock options, performance bonuses, upside tied to rapid subscriber growth, and ad deals. Time Warner lifers were rewarded for stability, protecting brands, hitting predictable profit targets. One side was incentivized to take ruthless risks, the other to avoid public embarrassment at all costs. Even when executives stood on stage and talked about unity, their compensation plans were pulling them in opposite directions. In that environment, every meeting became a quiet status war. AOL veterans believed they had bought Time Warner with their inflated stock and were now the future. Time Warner insiders believed they were the real empire, indulging a temporary market bubble. It's an example of what happens when two companies merge on paper while secretly believing the other side is beneath them. No amount of synergy slides can overcome mutual contempt. The result was predictable. Instead of one integrated giant, you had two feuding courts under one roof. And as the market turned, that internal Cold War would become fatal. But it didn't have to end in a Cold War and a write-down the size of a small nation's GDP. There was a time when the same ingredients could have produced something leaner, quieter, and far more dangerous for everyone else in the industry. Imagine a lighter touch alliance instead of a full corporate wedding. No $165 billion empire on paper, No frantic promise to fuse every cable system, dial-up modem, and movie studio overnight. Just a joint venture around a few crown jewels. HBO as the premium streaming experiment, CNN as the real-time news engine for the web, maybe Warner Brothers as the digital library. AOL brings the audience and the pipes. Time Warner brings the content and the brands, and both sides keep their balance sheets and their pride. On that path, AOL doesn't need to own Time Warner's entire life. It simply needs access. Revenue-sharing deals could have turned AOL into the preferred online distributor for Time Warner content without swallowing the whole company. Every HBO subscription sold through AOL's portal. Every CNN clip streamed through its homepage. Every early 2000s movie download could have thrown off a split. A predictable stream of money for Time Warner. A scalable new revenue engine for AOL. Less glory. Fewer magazine covers, far more flexibility. Because with a partnership, culture doesn't have to merge at gunpoint. The buttoned-up media family in Manhattan could have stayed on its own governance track, with clear joint venture boards set up as experimental zones. AOL's faster, more chaotic internet culture could have tried new pricing models, interactive shows, even early social features around HBO series, without forcing Time Warner's entire bureaucracy to pretend it suddenly understood chat rooms. Separate accounting, separate HR, shared upside. Let me take you back to the timing. Before AOL's valuation went vertical, a smaller equity stake in Time Warner, or even a series of narrowly defined joint ventures, would have anchored the relationship in reality, not in stock market fantasy. After broadband started to emerge, a more cautious deal, with performance triggers and exit ramps, could have protected both sides if dial-up collapsed faster than expected. His story is one of how bubbles tempt leaders to skip the boring guardrails that would save them later. And that's the point. The idea of tech-media collaboration was not the villain here. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the vision of combining distribution and content was strategically sound. The failure came from scale, structure, and hubris, from insisting on the biggest merger ever, the grandest narrative, the instant empire. It's an example of what happens when executives chase immortality instead of testing, learning, and earning their way into the future. Because while a smarter partnership might not have made anyone a legend overnight, it could have preserved wealth, created new power, and given both companies a chance to evolve, before the market delivered its own, much harsher redesign. And that redesign didn't stop with AOL and Time Warner. There was a time when every new tech media marriage promised to be the one that finally got it right, the one that would turn chaos into a perfectly controlled empire. Let me take you back to the mid-2010s. Telecom giants, built on cables and phone lines, started buying storytellers. AT&T swallowed Time Warner and rebranded it as Warner Media. Verizon picked up AOL, then Yahoo, then tried to weld them into a digital ad machine. Platforms that once just hosted content began quietly buying the factories that made it. Amazon taking MGM, Netflix building its own studios, Apple pouring money into Apple TV+. Different names, same dream. The pitch barely changed. Own the pipes, own the content, own the customer. Executives promised vertical integration, owning the stack, leveraging data to supercharge storytelling. Not only would they deliver movies and shows, they would track every click, every pause, every abandoned episode, then feed that data back into the creative process like some omniscient script doctor. On paper, it sounded ruthless, efficient, inevitable. But the ghost of AOL Time Warner was always in the room. After the worst deal in history, bankers and boards became more cautious, at least on the surface. Integration plans were drawn in painful detail. Synergy targets were trimmed from wild fantasies to disciplined estimates. Some CEOs even admitted, with a straight face, that not every cross-promotion would work. His story is one of hubris. Theirs tried to be one of sober realism. And yet, the same cracks kept appearing. Cultures collided. Phone company lifers measuring success in average revenue per user, now managing filmmakers who cared about awards, prestige, and the strange, irrational life of a story. Engineers who worshipped dashboards, suddenly telling comedians how to pace a joke. Boardrooms talking about content libraries, while writers talked about characters, families, and flawed human beings. It was, at times, inspiring and at times chilling to watch creativity translated into spreadsheets. Regulators, burned by the last wave, stepped in harder. Antitrust lawsuits, blocked mergers, forced divestitures. Promises that bundling wireless plans with blockbuster franchises will delight consumers. Met a colder question: will it actually lower prices or just concentrate power? Optimistic projections about how viewers would behave. Binge this, subscribe to that, never cancel. Crashed into a reality where people shared passwords, churned constantly, and treated loyalty as optional. So when a new, transformative deal is announced today, with glossy sizzle reels and talk of synergy, it's an example of what happens when history whispers and executives pretend not to hear. The AOL Time Warner saga is not a one-off freak accident. It's a template, a warning label printed in $165 billion of lost wealth and broken power. Because the next time a CEO promises to redefine the future of media, the real question is not how big the empire will be on day one, but whether the pieces can live together long enough to survive day two. And that's where our story turns next. And here's the twist that made the whole merger feel even crueler. While AOL and Time Warner were arguing over whose logo went on the letterhead, the very idea of an internet gatekeeper was being quietly rewritten. There was a time when signing into AOL felt like walking through the front door of the online world. You entered the walled garden, clicked through curated channels, and let a small team of editors decide what the internet looked like. Then the walls cracked. The open web exploded. Websites multiplied. And instead of dialing into one company's garden, people began roaming freely. Search engines took that chaos and turned it into a map. And when Google refined that map with PageRank, relevance, and speed, the center of gravity shifted from "come inside our service" to "we'll find whatever you want, anywhere it lives." In that new world, AOL's model looked slow, narrow, and strangely paternal. Users no longer needed a branded lobby with a few polished doors. They wanted every door, instantly. The browser address bar, not the AOL welcome screen, became the real front desk of digital life. Google's clean white page, with one box and almost no decoration, quietly did what AOL's busy home screen never could. It scaled to the entire web. Then came the second wave. Social platforms like Facebook didn't just point to pages. They built never-ending feeds. Instead of AOL editors deciding what appeared on your screen, algorithms tuned themselves on your behavior, your friends, your clicks. Let me take you back to that feeling of watching the AOL inbox slowly refresh. Now compare it to an infinite scroll that updates every second and never runs out. One feels like a waiting room. The other feels like a casino. These new giants had studied the early internet's growing pains. They avoided metered access and per-minute charges that made users feel watched and poor. They focused on scale, reliability, and one thing above all, advertising systems that could follow you everywhere. Because of that, The new empire of the web was not built on owning phone lines or sending CDs. It was built on owning attention and harvesting data from nearly every click. That's the pattern interrupt. The most valuable network was no longer the one carrying the signal, but the one predicting what would keep you staring. It's an example of what happens when technology shifts the battlefield from infrastructure to insight. And Time Warner's proud catalog? CNN, HBO, Warner Bros. All that content would finally reach audiences through gateways that didn't even exist when the merger was signed, distributed, and monetized on platforms that owed nothing to AOL's vision. The power had moved. The question was who inside this uneasy family would notice it first, and what they would do when they realized the old gate had already been bypassed. There was a time when owning the pipe and owning the show looked like the highest form of power. Control the distribution, control the content, and you don't just make money, you build an empire. On paper, AOL Time Warner had that dream in its hands. And here's the twist. The dream itself wasn't foolish. Combining a massive audience gateway with a deep catalog of movies, news, and entertainment was directionally right. It anticipated what streaming bundles, app stores, and even today's tech giants do. Tie together access and content inside one digital ecosystem. In another life, this could have been the prototype for Netflix plus Comcast plus Disney, all fused into one. But timing is ruthless. Let me take you back to the year 2000. The gateway to the internet was still a dial-up modem screaming through a phone line. Broadband penetration in American homes was tiny. Yet AOL's dial-up cash machine was valued richer than Time Warner's entire library of CNN, HBO, and Warner Brothers. That mismatch turned a prescient vision into a trap. The merger locked both sides into the wrong technology and the wrong structure at the exact wrong moment. Dial-up, a business already quietly dying, became the foundation for a $165 billion all-stock deal. When the dot-com bubble burst, AOL's inflated shares collapsed, and with them the currency that had bought Time Warner. The empire wasn't just early. It was early with a melting asset. This is the difference between being directionally right and tactically right. Directionally, they saw where life online was going. On-demand media, interactive services, a world where screens would swallow newspapers and cable boxes. Tactically, they chose a lumbering, culture-clashing mega-merger, welded to a noisy modem, right before broadband, mobile, and independent platforms rewrote the rules. It's an example of what happens when the map is accurate, but the vehicle is already running out of gas. Markets rarely reward being early if the economics don't work yet. Dial-up margins were fat, but churn was high, growth was slowing, and the cost of dragging a huge media conglomerate into the future outweighed the benefits. The story sounded flawless at press conferences. The spreadsheets did not care. When reality arrived, it wrote down nearly $99 billion in goodwill and erased the illusion in a single, brutal stroke. So what does that mean for you, watching this now, in a world of crypto tokens, AI models, and metaverse land sales? The pattern is the same. Vision is cheap. Timing and structure are expensive. A project can be right about where the world is headed and still destroy wealth if it chooses the wrong tech stack, the wrong capital structure, or the wrong moment to scale. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the AOL Time Warner story is a reminder. Before chasing the next big frontier, you have to ask not just, is this the future? But, is this the right way, right now? Because the next section will show what happened to those who never asked that question at all. That question wasn't asked in boardrooms alone. It echoed in living rooms, cramped apartments, and rented condos filled with half-unpacked boxes and branded swag from a company that no longer knew what it wanted to be. Because that $165 billion promise didn't just vanish from a balance sheet, it dissolved right through people's lives. There was a time when joining AOL Time Warner felt like stepping into history. One engineer from Ohio sold his house, dragged his family to Northern Virginia, and told his kids they were moving to the center of the internet. He accepted stock-heavy compensation, worked nights wiring legacy Time Warner systems into AOL's creaking dial-up empire, and repeated to himself that the sacrifices would pay off when the future finally arrived. 2 years later, the share price had collapsed, his options were worthless, and the only thing that had really scaled was his exhaustion. Let me take you back to a young producer at HBO who thought digital would set her free. Her story is one of early streaming experiments, ambitious interactive projects, and then budgets frozen mid-shoot. The mandate changed every quarter. Build for AOL chat, then for broadband, then for some new portal integration that never quite materialized. Scripts were rewritten, pilots delayed, entire teams reassigned to synergy initiatives that existed mostly in PowerPoint. Careers that should have been defined by iconic shows were instead defined by waiting for a strategy memo that made sense. Across Time Warner studios, creative professionals watched long-planned films and series pushed aside so executives could chase the latest online tie-in. A director was told to cut scenes to save money for a web companion project. 6 months later, that website was quietly canceled. Animators who had fought their way out of poverty into a world of color and imagination found themselves storyboarding banner ads and cross-promotions, not because anyone believed in them, but because someone in AOL wanted more clicks. It's an example of what happens when a merger treats art as a rounding error. In the middle sat the managers, not the CEOs on magazine covers, but the people with 30 direct reports and 2 conflicting calendars. AOL leadership demanded speed, risk, and user growth at all costs. Time Warner leadership demanded protection of brands, tight legal control, and predictable profit. One week, a manager in New York was ordered to give AOL free access to premium content. The next week, a different executive warned that doing so would destroy the business model. Choosing which email to obey meant choosing which side to disappoint. The emotional toll was quiet but brutal. Employees who had once bragged about working at CNN or Warner Brothers now mumbled AOL Time Warner and waited for the smirk. Brand pride turned into a punchline. People who had tied their identity to building something lasting were left feeling like extras in a cautionary tale that business schools would mock for decades. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the internal message had been, "Help build the future." The lived reality felt more like helping bury 2 giants, and yet this was only the first wave of consequences, hitting those closest to the blast radius. The next wave would reach far beyond the company walls. That second wave didn't come from angry employees or betrayed shareholders. It came from the referees of the system itself, the people who were supposed to blow the whistle if this $165 billion dream looked more like a slow-motion collision. There was a time when the AOL Time Warner merger sat on the desks of the most powerful regulators in America. The Federal Trade Commission, the Federal Communications Commission, antitrust lawyers at the Department of Justice. They all took their turn sifting through binders, charts, and confident PowerPoint decks explaining how this new empire would change life online. They did not simply wave it through. They negotiated conditions, drafted consent orders, and tried to fence in the power they were about to approve. The main fear was not that AOL and Time Warner would crush all media forever. It was that they would use their combined cable pipes and online gateway to lock out rivals. So regulators forced them to open Time Warner's high-speed cable lines to competing internet providers, banned exclusive deals that would freeze out other media partners, and imposed behavioral rules around instant messaging and content carriage. On paper, it looked like a tight rulebook. In practice, it was a bet that competition was already strong enough to keep them honest. Because from a traditional antitrust perspective, this did not look like Standard Oil 2.0. AOL faced Microsoft, Yahoo, and a wave of upstart portals. Time Warner went up against Disney, Viacom, News Corp, CBS, cable, satellite, early broadband, DVDs, game consoles. The market was crowded, noisy, and flush with money. The logic was simple. If dominance is temporary and rivals are everywhere, then the real risk is blocking innovation, not blocking a single merger. Here is the problem. Regulators were trying to read the future of a market that was mutating in real time. Let me take you back to 2000. Google was barely a curiosity, broadband penetration was tiny, and social media did not exist. Predicting whether AOL Time Warner would become terrifyingly dominant or embarrassingly irrelevant meant guessing how millions of users, dozens of technologies, and trillions of future dollars would collide. That is not law. That is fortune-telling with footnotes. So they did what regulators often do in fast-moving tech markets. They measured current market share, compared it to historic monopolies, imposed conditions that sounded tough, and trusted that if anything went wrong, new complaints and new cases would follow. It's an example of what happens when the rulebook is built for railroads and oil pipelines, then applied to chat rooms and cable modems. Could stricter oversight have saved AOL Time Warner? Maybe it could have stopped some concentration. Maybe it could have delayed certain abuses. But it could not protect the company from its own strategic illusions. No regulator could force executives to respect dial-up's limits, to understand culture, or to show humility about inflated valuations. His story is one of ruthless ambition, meeting regulatory caution. Theirs is one of internal governance failing, where external oversight never even had jurisdiction. The real disaster was not that the referees swallowed the whistle. It was that inside the empire, no one wanted to call a foul on themselves, and the market was about to do it for them, far more brutally than any agency ever could. There was a time when executives at AOL Time Warner could point to the headlines and say, "No one saw this coming. The dot-com crash, the recession, the advertising freeze." On the surface, it felt like a natural disaster that just happened to hit their empire at the worst possible moment. Yes, the storm was real. When the bubble burst, internet valuations collapsed across the board, venture money vanished, and even solid companies watched their market caps evaporate. Telecoms drowned in debt, banner ad rates fell off a cliff, and dial-up suddenly looked like yesterday's technology. But here is the crucial difference. Many of those firms were battered and bruised, and still survived. AOL Time Warner didn't just get wet, it nearly sank. Let me take you back to the core of the deal. This was a $165 billion stock swap built on AOL shares that were themselves inflated by bubble psychology, not by a resilient cash engine. The money wasn't sitting in a vault. It was floating on market euphoria. When that euphoria disappeared, so did the cushion. A well-structured merger might have been anchored to hard assets, conservative assumptions, and a plan for life after dial-up. This one was anchored to belief. Because of that, every structural flaw that had been papered over by rising prices suddenly mattered. There was no serious integration blueprint. no clear map for how AOL's aggressive sales culture would mesh with Time Warner's slower, committee-driven world. One side moved fast and broke things. The other held meetings and guarded legacy brands. Instead of a unified family, the new company got internal Cold War, with each camp protecting its own fiefdom and quietly hoping the other side would be blamed. Layered on top of that was cultural arrogance. AOL leaders assumed their internet power would rewrite the rules of media overnight, while Time Warner veterans believed their libraries, channels, and Hollywood prestige would always command attention. Both misread broadband. High-speed access didn't entrench AOL's walled garden, it blew a hole straight through it. Once people could go anywhere on the web at cable speeds, they didn't need a dial-up gatekeeper mailing them CDs. So when the downturn hit, AOL Time Warner had no margin of safety. The dial-up cash cow was already dying. The promised synergy between content and access never materialized, and the combined balance sheet was weighed down by goodwill that would soon be written down by nearly $99 billion. There was no stable core business model to fall back on, just clashing cultures, shrinking subscribers, and an empire whose wealth had been more illusion than reality. Calling that outcome bad luck is comforting, but dangerous. It turns a man-made catastrophe into a weather report and quietly excuses the people who designed it. This isn't just a sad chapter in corporate life. It's an example of what happens when hype replaces discipline, when power goes unchallenged inside the boardroom, and when leaders learn the wrong lesson from surviving one boom and walk straight into the next bust. When a disaster gets blamed on the bubble, it sounds like gravity failed. But gravity was working just fine. The real problem was that the people in charge kept staring at the sky while the ground under their empire was quietly cracking. Let me take you back to the late 1990s. There was a time when AOL looked untouchable. Those dial-up CDs were everywhere. The "You've Got Mail" chime felt like the voice of the future, and executives convinced themselves that millions of subscribers locked into a walled garden meant permanent power. But outside that garden, broadband adoption curves were bending almost vertically. Cable and DSL lines were spreading. Users were discovering the open web, and the data was brutal. Time spent on unrestricted browsers was growing faster than time spent inside AOL's curated portal. Customers could feel it before the spreadsheets caught up. Dial-up pages crawled, images stalled, and downloading a simple video felt like a test of faith. People were paying premium money for a connection that suddenly felt like poverty in a broadband world. Surveys showed rising frustration, early churn, and a simple behavioral tell. As soon as households got faster access, they used AOL as a login, and then rushed straight past it. The gateway to the internet was quietly being demoted to a doorstop. Inside the merged company, the cultural signals were just as loud. Early integration meetings were less marriage of equals and more awkward family reunion. Time Warner's executives arrived with decades of process, hierarchy, and legal caution. AOL's leaders came in with stock option swagger and a move-fast attitude that had worked when rules were still being written. Instead of shared projects, there were turf wars. Instead of trust, there was deep suspicion about who would control money, brands, and credit. At times inspiring and at times chilling, the conversations revealed two worlds that spoke different corporate languages and quietly believed the other side was the problem. The numbers were whispering too. Even before the deal closed, AOL's subscriber growth was slowing. Each new dial-up customer cost more to acquire, the easy wins were gone, and marketing spend had to rise just to stand still. That is not how a limitless growth story behaves. On Wall Street and in the press, A few skeptical analysts and journalists started asking pointed questions about the valuation, about whether dial-up profits could really justify paying more than CNN, HBO, and Warner Brothers combined. Those questions were waved away as a lack of vision. The story was too good, the paper wealth too intoxicating. And that is the quiet lesson here. In any major decision, the most important data points are often the ones that contradict the story you most want to believe. The AOL Time Warner merger had those signals everywhere, flashing red. The tragedy is not that they weren't visible. The tragedy is what leadership chose to do next, and who paid the price when reality finally walked through the door. Reality did not just walk through the door. It sat down at the head of the table and rewrote the agenda. The empire that had promised to own the future suddenly found itself arguing over what it could realistically afford next quarter. For Time Warner, there was a time when the dream was total domination. Pipes, platforms, and the world's most glamorous media brands, all marching in lockstep. What it finally got was something smaller, narrower, more cautious. Over the next decade, the grand strategy quietly shrank to a single hard question: what actually makes money? The answer kept pointing back to a few crown jewels: HBO, Warner Brothers, the DC Universe. The company that once bragged about being AOL Time Warner began shedding cable systems, music, magazines, whatever wasn't bolted to premium film and prestige TV. The rhetoric of synergy faded. The language of core content assets took its place. Let me take you back to the irony here. The old-line media giant that had supposedly needed AOL's internet magic to survive the future would, years later, be carved up and resold not for dial-up access, but for those same traditional brands. First came the formal split of Time Warner Cable. Then, in 2009, AOL was spun off like a failed experiment. By the mid-2010s, Time Warner was no longer an aspiring digital platform. It was a content arsenal waiting to be acquired. AT&T's 2018 takeover and the later spin into Warner Brothers Discovery were not the triumphant expansions once promised. They were defensive restructurings around HBO, CNN, and Warner Brothers as streaming ammunition in a new kind of war. AOL's arc was even starker. The company that had swaggered into the deal as the face of the internet left it as a mid-tier media and advertising shop. After the spin-off, leadership tried to erase the dial-up past with a new story. AOL as a digital content network and ad tech player. It bought Patch to chase local news, TechCrunch and the Huffington Post to chase influence, and a string of ad platforms to chase targeting and data. The access provider empire of chat rooms and busy signals was gone. In its place stood a portfolio of websites and ad units, fighting for relevance in a world now ruled by Google and Facebook. Because of that lost decade, both companies spent their time not conquering new worlds, but repairing damage, riding down goodwill, unwinding bad bets, reassuring investors, explaining to employees why the life they had been promised at the height of the bubble had quietly disappeared. It's an example of what happens when the story outruns the balance sheet. The next chapter is not glorious expansion, but slow, grinding repair. And that contrast is the real lesson. A deal once hailed as historic, a merger that was supposed to dictate the terms of the digital age, dissolved into modest, incremental moves. A divestiture here, a streaming app there, a rebrand, a spin-off, a merger of necessity rather than ambition. His story is one of at times inspiring and at times chilling scale. Theirs became a cautionary footnote about narrative collapse. The empire of the future ended up arguing over subscription bundles and advertising CPMs. Here is the pattern interrupt. For all the talk of vision, the most powerful players in media and tech spent the 2000s and early 2010s acting less like emperors and more like survivors, clinging to the few assets the market still valued. The grand promise of owning the internet gave way to a scramble just to matter on it. And as new powers rose, Google, Apple, Facebook, Netflix, the question hanging over the remnants of AOL and Time Warner was no longer, how big can this get? But something far smaller and far more humbling. Where do we even fit now? There was a time when owning everything looked like the ultimate form of power. Cable systems, movie studios, magazines, dial-up access, chat rooms, news networks, all stacked into one towering empire. On paper, it felt invincible. In reality, it was standing on sand. Because in the digital age, power doesn't come from owning every building on the street, it comes from owning the street itself. The choke points, search boxes that decide what people see, social graphs that decide who they hear, app stores that decide what can even reach them, or unique IP so magnetic that platforms are forced to bend around it. Whoever controls those bottlenecks doesn't need to own everything. Everything quietly ends up flowing through them anyway. AOL misread that completely. Let me take you back to the dial-up years. The company mailed millions of CDs, locked in tens of millions of subscribers, and, for a moment, held the keys to the internet for the average American family. It felt like permanent control. But what they really owned was a temporary on-ramp, not the highway. When broadband arrived, when browsers improved, when Google made finding any site effortless, that access pipe stopped being a choke point and started being a commodity. AOL confused a billing relationship with a behavioral monopoly, and the market punished that mistake with ruthless efficiency. Time Warner made the mirror image error. It believed its legacy brands and distribution channels were an iron wall. CNN, HBO, Warner Bros., print magazines, cable carriage deals, physical theaters, all looked like a fortress built out of decades of money and cultural prestige. But technology attacks walls from underneath. DVRs let viewers skip ads, piracy undercut DVDs, broadband made streaming possible, and suddenly the old gatekeepers discovered the gates were standing in an open field. The protection they trusted turned out to be leverage only as long as the underlying technology stood still. Today's giants are not immune. They are simply earlier in the story. Streaming platforms spend billions on content while discovering that owning a library is not the same as owning attention. Social networks chase short-form video while quietly watching their youngest users drift away. App stores face regulators, search engines face AI overviews, and everyone, from Netflix to Meta, is tempted to believe that today's choke point is eternal. It's an example of what happens when success feels like physics instead of what it really is, a fragile truce between technology, behavior, and law. His story is one of empires, but not just corporate ones. It's about the empires in people's heads, the belief that certain companies are too big to fail, too woven into daily life to ever be displaced. Yet the AOL Time Warner merger shows how quickly wealth can evaporate, how fast a narrative can flip from future of media to cautionary tale. When viewed up close, these giants stop looking like monoliths and start looking like contingent systems held together by confidence, regulation, and habits that can change. And that raises a harder question for the present. If even the largest empires can vanish, what exactly are we trusting when we build our lives, our news, even our sense of reality on top of them? There was a time when a press conference could erase critical thinking. A CEO said, "revolutionary." The market heard "inevitable," and careers, pensions, and empires marched in behind the slogan. To avoid living through the next AOL Time Warner, viewers need something colder than hype, a checklist. Not a vibe, not a feeling, but a way to interrogate the story before it interrogates their bank account and their life. Because when a $165 billion deal can wipe out two giants, it's an example of what happens when no one stops to ask the right questions. First red flag. The deal is justified mainly by buzzwords and synergies. In 2000, executives talked about convergence, cross-promotion, and a new digital future, while almost no one could explain, in plain language, how sending AOL dial-up users to Time Warner magazines would actually grow profit per user. Whenever the pitch leans on scale, ecosystem, or platform, without showing clear unit economics, what they earn on each customer, each ad, each subscription, that's not a strategy. That's a spell. So the first question for any merger: what specific capabilities does each side bring to the table? Not in theory, but in hard detail. One company might have world-class distribution, the other a library of films, patents, or user data. The next question is harsher. Can those pieces be combined without destroying value through chaos, distraction, and turf wars? If the answer depends on everyone suddenly behaving better than they have in their entire corporate history, skepticism is a form of self-defense. Then comes the part almost no spreadsheet can save: culture. Let me take you back to those early AOL Time Warner meetings. On one side, brash internet executives who moved fast, chased growth, and treated regulations as speed bumps. On the other, an old media aristocracy with layers of hierarchy, careful legal review, and a long memory. His story is one of numbers, but their merger was a story of incompatible habits. Decision-making styles clashed, incentive structures pulled people in opposite directions, and the promised empire of synergy dissolved into internal Cold War. Cultural due diligence means asking, how do these organizations actually make decisions? Who gets rewarded, and for what? If one side pays bonuses for short-term subscriber growth while the other is punished for risk, the combined company will fight itself long before it fights competitors. Another warning sign sits in the fine print: the all-stock mega deal. AOL did not pay $165 billion in cash. It paid with inflated shares. When one side's soaring valuation is doing most of the work, the merger quietly depends on the bubble never popping. Viewers should ask, if this had to be paid in cash, at this price, would anyone still be smiling on stage? Treat this checklist as armor. For investments, for careers, for any company tempted to chase the next grand narrative. Because the next worst deal in history is already being pitched somewhere, and in the next chapter, the pressure to believe will only grow louder. But armor is only useful if someone remembers to wear it. Because beneath the spreadsheets and the legal documents, this was never just a $165 billion transaction. It was a story about destiny, about inevitability, about a new empire rising where old media and new money would fuse into something unstoppable. Executives repeated it on stage, bankers whispered it in conference rooms, journalists printed it on front pages. The more it was told, the more it felt like truth. There was a time when that kind of ambition was celebrated without question. The same hunger that built railroads, steel mills, and global oil giants now dressed itself in dial-up tones and glossy magazine covers. Ambition can pull a family out of poverty, build careers, and create enormous wealth. But when no one asks where the line is, that same ambition keeps going, eats through caution, and finally crosses into catastrophic overreach. At AOL Time Warner, everyone became an actor in the same script. Steve Case wasn't just a CEO, he was the visionary who had won the internet. Gerald Levin wasn't just running Time Warner, he was the wise statesman handing his empire to the future. Investors told themselves that any price made sense because this is the future. Employees told themselves that paper gains on their options meant they were set for life. When that many people agree on a story, disagreement starts to feel like betrayal. Let me take you back to those press conferences. The language was almost religious. Historic. Transformative. Once in a lifetime. No one wanted to be the person who stood up and said quietly, "But what if the dial-up king is already dying? What if this culture clash can't be managed? What if the math doesn't care about the narrative?" When a story becomes immune to questions, it stops being strategy and starts becoming a spell. His story is one of boardrooms, not battlefields, but the moral tension is the same, at times inspiring and at times chilling. Visionary risk-taking is how new industries are born. Reckless gambling is how pensions vanish, careers evaporate, and thousands wake up to find their life savings cut in half because someone needed to be bold. The line between the two is paper-thin, and it usually disappears the moment people start believing that this time, the normal rules of gravity have been suspended. It's an example of what happens when narrative outruns evidence, when power is wrapped in a heroic plot, and when no one wants to be the one to say no. The next time a world-changing story is offered, with charts, with slogans, with promises that you can't afford to miss this, what role will you choose? Will you be another extra in someone else's epic, or the person who quietly, ruthlessly, checks whether the story still holds up when the music stops? Because in the chapters ahead, the music is about to stop. Because in the chapters ahead, the music is about to stop. There was a time when that music sounded unstoppable. A dial-up chime, "You've got mail," and suddenly AOL looked like the front door to the entire internet. Millions of households paid every month just to pass through it. On the other side stood Time Warner, an old-world empire of cable lines and movie studios, CNN, HBO, Warner Bros., magazines that shaped what families read and watched and argued about at the dinner table. Let me take you back to January 2000, when those two worlds crashed together. A $165 billion all-stock deal, the largest merger in history, promised to fuse dial-up dreams with Hollywood power. Not only did it unite the biggest internet gateway with one of the most powerful media companies on Earth, it was sold as the blueprint for the future of money, media, and attention. The story was simple. AOL's new wealth plus Time Warner's old assets would create a giant no one could touch. Instead, it created a crater no one could ignore. Within just a few years, AOL Time Warner wrote down around $99 billion, one of the largest single corporate losses ever recorded. The combined value of the company fell by more than 80% from its peak, erasing hundreds of billions in shareholder wealth. Retirement accounts, pension funds, small investors who believed the narrative of destiny watched their savings quietly evaporate, while executives explained it away as non-cash. The money was very real on the way up. It was very real on the way down. How does that happen? His story is one of bubble psychology, at times inspiring and at times chilling in its confidence. Investors, bankers, journalists, even regulators convinced themselves that the internet had rewritten the laws of gravity. AOL's stock price, inflated by dial-up subscriptions and advertising dreams, became the currency that bought Time Warner's tangible empire. Because everyone believed the future would arrive on schedule, no one asked what would happen when broadband made dial-up obsolete. Inside the new giant, the damage deepened. It's an example of what happens when cultural arrogance meets structural weakness. On one side, AOL's brash young executives who believed they had conquered the future with chat rooms and CDs. On the other, Time Warner's corporate aristocracy used to slow deals, careful control, and traditional power. The merger contract locked in AOL's influence just as its business model was dying, turning a temporary illusion into a long-term cage. And yet, this story refuses to stay in the past. Every new tech cycle brings the same temptations: narrative-driven valuations, world-saving slogans, once-in-a-lifetime deals, streaming, crypto, social media, AI. Each wave arrives with its own version of "you can't afford to miss this." The names change, the pattern does not. So the question now turns to you. In the next chapter, the focus shifts from boardrooms to daily life, from a $165 billion mistake to the smaller but very real decisions about power, hype, and risk that shape personal wealth. When the next grand story arrives at your door, promising a future that sounds too smooth to fail, how will you respond when the music starts playing again? When that next grand story arrives, the first move is not to say yes or no. The first move is to ask a quieter, more dangerous question. What would have to be true for this to actually work? Not in the pitch deck, in reality. There was a time when owning the dial-up gateway to the internet and the world's most powerful media library sounded like a cheat code. For AOL and Time Warner to justify a $165 billion empire, several things had to be true at once. Dial-up had to stay dominant, advertising money had to grow forever, the cultures had to blend, and the economics had to survive gravity. Almost none of that happened. That gap between the story and the facts is where the wealth disappeared. So the habit to build is simple and ruthless. The next time someone says, "This app will own all attention. This token will replace money. This company will be the AOL Time Warner of AI," stop and ask, what would have to be true about user behavior, about regulation, about competition, about interest rates? Then ask a second question. How many of those assumptions already exist in the real world, and how many live only in the slide deck? Let this merger become a permanent mental model. When a narrative feels unstoppable, check for 3 fractures. First, hype. Are people paying for a story about the future or for cash flows in the present? AOL's valuation was built on dial-up dreams long after the modem was already dying. Second, cultural mismatch. Does the fast, chaotic side actually respect the slow, regulated side, or is one family quietly sneering at the other? Third, fragile economics. Does the deal still make sense if growth slows, if the market falls, if the synergies never arrive? At times inspiring and at times chilling, his story is one of small, unfashionable questions that would have saved gigantic fortunes. Being the dissenting voice in a room that smells like easy money does not make someone a cynic. It makes them the only person in the meeting who remembers that behind every ticker symbol are pensions, college funds, and entire lives. So when friends, colleagues, or social media feeds are unanimously excited about a can't-miss opportunity, try one tiny rebellion. Say, "Let me take you back to the worst deal in corporate history." Then walk through the hype, the culture clash, the fragile economics, not to mock the dream, but to respect reality and the people whose savings might be pulled into the dream. Because skepticism here is not about being negative. It is about refusing to outsource judgment to headlines, to influencers, to the loudest voice in the room. It is an example of what happens when everyday investors quietly build their own filters instead of renting someone else's conviction. And if this story sharpened those filters even a little, there is an entire hidden archive of other mergers, crashes, and quiet close calls waiting in the background of this channel. The next one takes an even more beloved narrative and pulls at a loose thread that most people never see coming. There was a time when AOL tried to own the front door to the entire internet. Those dial-up CDs, those "you've got mail" pings, those walled garden chat rooms were not just nostalgia. They were an attempt to decide what millions of people saw first, clicked first, believed first. Today, the logos have changed, the speed has changed, but the ambition is exactly the same. Now it is not a dial-up portal. It is a feed, a home screen, a For You page that quietly decides which empire-building fantasy gets promoted and which slow, boring, real story disappears under a pile of memes. By brutally filtering, ranking, and amplifying, modern platforms do what AOL and Time Warner only dreamed of, turning attention into money, money into power, and power into an invisible kind of editorial control. But here is the part that never quite makes it into the press releases. Your real leverage is not owning a cable network or a search engine. Your leverage is deciding what earns your focus for 10 or 20 or 40 minutes. Every time a long, skeptical breakdown wins over a shiny 2-minute hype reel, a tiny piece of that control moves away from the algorithm and back into your hands. That is why this channel exists. Videos like this are not just entertainment about a disastrous $165 billion merger. They are tools. They map out how hype is manufactured, how empires are sold to the public as destiny, how executives talk about synergy while quietly cashing out. It is an example of what happens when attention is treated as an exploitable resource instead of a responsibility. So if this story has been, at times inspiring, and at times chilling, let it also be practical. Subscribe, like, and share not as a reflex, but as a way of programming your own feed toward deeper, slower analysis. Think of it as curating your information diet, the way a ruthless CEO curates a balance sheet, cutting empty calories and quietly compounding insight. Here is the pattern interrupt. Do not just watch. Comment. Call out the other worst deals and empire-building attempts that deserve an autopsy. The SoftBank bets that went sideways, the media roll-ups that imploded, the quiet near misses that almost rewired everyday life. When those suggestions pile up, passive viewing turns into a running investigation, and this community stops being an audience and starts behaving like a research team. Because his story is one of control and collapse, but your story does not have to be. Every click is a tiny vote for the kind of narratives that survive. Choosing thoughtful, long-form breakdowns over empty hype is a quiet act of resistance, a way of saying that wealth without understanding is not enough. And in the next chapter, that resistance meets the next empire that thought it was untouchable. And in the next chapter, that resistance meets the next empire that thought it was untouchable. To see it clearly, let me take you back to that hotel ballroom in January 2000, the day the $165 billion dream was born. Cameras flashing, executives lined up like royalty, the AOL logo glowing next to Time Warner's. Not only was it the largest merger in history, it was sold as the moment when old media and the new internet would fuse into a single, unstoppable empire. There was a time when anyone reading that headline was told this was the future. Dial-up access plus CNN, HBO, and Warner Brothers measured in money, power, and reach, it sounded unbeatable. Because of that intoxicating pitch and the euphoria of the dot-com bubble, rational people convinced themselves that a company mailing out free trial CDs should be worth more than a studio that had been printing hits for decades. The story was clean, heroic, inevitable, until it wasn't. Fast forward. The name AOL Time Warner quietly disappears. AOL is spun off, shrinking from would-be conqueror of the internet to a reminder of dial-up poverty in a broadband world. Time Warner itself is carved up, rebranded, and eventually sold again, the once mighty family of brands passed around like distressed assets instead of eternal crowns. The original empire vision is erased from the skyline, but not from the balance sheets, where that $90 billion write-down still reads like a tombstone. His story is one of numbers that looked like destiny and then turned into evidence. Evidence of how hype can be mistaken for wealth, how paper empires can evaporate while the debt, the lawsuits, and the broken careers remain painfully real. It's an example of what happens when executives start believing their own press releases, when the fantasy of synergy outruns the slow, boring work of actually integrating two lives, two cultures, two companies. And somewhere, right now, behind frosted glass and keycard doors, another group of executives is telling a new version of the same story. The buzzwords have changed. Today, it's AI, creator economy, metaverse, super app. Tomorrow, it will be something else. But the temptations are familiar. Pay any price, promise any growth curve, announce the next historic deal that will finally own the future. The room laughs at the right moments. The bankers nod. The slides look beautiful. When that press conference hits your feed, will you only see the headline, the smiling handshake, the record-breaking valuation? Or will you hear, faintly underneath the applause, the screech of a dial-up modem and the echo of a $165 billion promise that never came true? Empires rise and fall. Names change. Logos change. Platforms change. But the pattern of unchecked greed and ambition colliding with reality is at times inspiring and at times chilling, and it always leaves a bill to be paid. The only real question is who pays it. Share this story. Look twice at the next miracle merger. And remember, every time you refuse the hype, another invisible empire loses a little of its power.